The frost on the greenhouse glass had melted into long streaks by the time my father-in-law found me sitting alone among the orchids, the contract for $61 million still unsigned in my lap, and when he asked if I was all right, I realized I had been crying without noticing. My name is Whitney, I'm 31, and until that morning in the greenhouse I had spent 6 years believing my own parents had simply forgotten how to love me. I know now that wasn't true, they hadn't forgotten. They had just decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Before I get into it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to build a family out of people who weren't required to love you, hit that like button, because this one's for you. It started in Barrie, Ontario, in February, the kind of cold that gets into your teeth. My husband Patrick had been gone 11 months by then, taken by a brain tumor that the specialists in Toronto found too late to do much about. And I was standing at his graveside with our twin daughters, Maddox and Sage, barely 4 months old, screaming into the wind because they were hungry and I hadn't slept enough to remember to feed them on time. My mother and father stood 20 feet away under an umbrella my younger sister Cassidy was holding for them. They did not come closer. When the service ended, my mother adjusted her gloves and said, "We have a flight to catch, Whitney. Your father's knee can't handle the cold much longer." That was it. That was the entirety of what they said to me on the day I buried my husband. I want to be fair because for years I tried to be fair to them in my head. My parents weren't cruel in the dramatic way you see in movies. They were cruel in the quieter way. The way of people who had decided, somewhere around the time I married a furniture restorer instead of the dentist they'd picked out for me, that I had become an inconvenience. Patrick made beautiful things with his hands. He took broken chairs and split tables that other people threw out and turned them into pieces people wanted in their homes. My parents thought that was beneath us. My father owned 3 car dealerships across central Ontario. My mother sat on the board of a private golf club. Cassidy had gone to law school and married a man who worked in mining finance, and in their eyes, Cassidy was the daughter who had done it right. When Patrick got sick, I called my parents 4 times before they answered. When they finally did, my father's first question wasn't about Patrick's prognosis. It was whether I'd asked Patrick's parents for help yet. Since that's really their responsibility now, isn't it? I didn't understand what he meant until later. He meant that whatever debt I was about to accumulate, he didn't want it landing anywhere near him. It was Patrick's parents, Denise and Roland, who showed up instead. Denise drove 4 hours from Sudbury the day I called crying about the second round of chemo costs, and she didn't bring advice. She brought a casserole, $1,000 in cash she pulled out of an envelope like it was nothing, and her sleeves already rolled up to do laundry. Roland, a quiet man who'd spent 30 years repairing furnaces, started showing up at the hospital on weekends just to sit with Patrick so I could sleep in the waiting room chair for an hour. When Patrick died, the bills were obscene. The house we'd bought together went to the bank within 4 months. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 babies and a single suitcase of Patrick's clothes I couldn't make myself donate yet. And it was Denise who called me on a Tuesday in April and said, "We have land, 40 acres outside Sudbury we're not using anymore, since Roland's hip won't let him farm it. Come live on it, build something, we'll help." I cried so hard on that phone call I couldn't speak. I won't pretend the next 6 years were easy because the comments under videos like this one always say, "and then everything was perfect." And that's never true. The first winter on that land, I lived in a trailer with my daughters while Roland and I framed out a small barn with our own hands, him directing me through every cut because I'd never held a circular saw in my life. Denise watched the girls during the day so I could work, and some nights I was so exhausted I fell asleep mid-sentence reading them their bedtime story. I started small, boarding horses for neighbors, mucking stalls myself at 5 in the morning, teaching myself everything from forum posts and library books because I couldn't afford lessons. By year 3 I had 12 horses boarded and a waiting list. By year 5 Sterling Hollow Stables had a training program, a small equestrian school, and a reputation good enough that people drove from Ottawa to bring their horses to me. Denise kept the books. Roland built every fence on that property himself, even after his hip surgery. Even after I begged him to let someone else do it. My own parents visited exactly twice in 6 years. Both times for under an hour. Both times because they happened to be passing through on their way to somewhere more important. So when the offer came in from a Toronto-based equestrian development group wanting to buy Sterling Hollow, land, barns, training facility, goodwill, all of it, for $61 million, I didn't call my parents first, I called Denise. She cried harder than I did. The deal was set to close at the end of June, signing at the offices of Caro Equestrian Holdings downtown, with a smaller celebration afterward that Denise had been planning for weeks without telling me the half of it. Because what she'd actually been planning, it turned out, was a 40th wedding anniversary renewal for her and Roland, the date falling that same week, and she'd kept it quiet because she didn't want it to feel like she was asking me for anything. That's the part that undid me when I found out. 6 years of her giving everything, and she was embarrassed to ask me for a wedding cake. My mother found out about the sale before I told her. Cassidy, who still kept tabs on me through mutual friends, must have mentioned it, because 3 days before closing, my mother called for the first time in 14 months. "Whitney, sweetheart, we've been thinking about you so much, sweetheart." She hadn't called me that since I was 19, I let her talk. She told me about a wonderful opportunity. Cassidy's husband's firm was sponsoring a charity gala in Muskoka, and wouldn't it be lovely if I could help underwrite a table or two, now that things are going so well for you? 2 tables came to $40,000. She mentioned it like she was suggesting I split an Uber. I told her I'd think about it, mostly because I was too tired to fight. And that was apparently all the encouragement she needed, because 2 days later, my parents and Cassidy showed up at the ranch unannounced, the morning of closing. I came out of the barn in my work boots, hair still under a bandana, to find my mother standing in my driveway in heels that were sinking into the gravel, looking at the renovated farmhouse like she was pricing it. "This is lovely, Whitney," she said. "The way you'd compliment a stranger's garden, really. We had no idea you'd done so well for yourself." My father was already walking the fence line like he was inspecting a dealership. Cassidy hung back near the car, scrolling her phone. "We won't stay long," my mother said. "We just wanted to see you before the big day, and Whitney, about the gala. I was thinking, with this sale closing, perhaps you could be a bit more generous than 2 tables. Your father's name carries weight in this province, you know. It would mean a great deal to be associated with something of this scale." I stood there in my own driveway, on land Patrick's parents had given me when my own parents wouldn't return my calls, and listened to my mother ask me to fund her social standing on the day I closed a $61 million deal she had nothing to do with. "You didn't come to Patrick's funeral to comfort me," I said. "You came to catch a flight." My mother's mouth tightened. "That's unfair, Whitney. We were grieving too. You stood under an umbrella 20 feet away. Denise drove 4 hours with cash in an envelope 2 days later. Where were you when the bank took the house? Where were you when I was mucking stalls at 5 a.m., with a baby strapped to my chest because I couldn't afford daycare?" "We didn't know it was that serious," my father said, which was its own kind of answer, because it meant they'd known something and simply hadn't cared enough to ask. I told them I needed to get to Toronto for the signing, and I watched my mother's face shift, doing the math, realizing the $61 million was about to become very real and she had maybe one more chance to attach herself to it. "We'll come with you," she said. "Show support. As a family." I almost said no. But some old stupid part of me, the part that still wanted, even after everything, for them to see what I'd built and feel something like pride, let them come. The signing room at Caro Equestrian Holdings had floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the harbor, and Denise and Roland were already there when I walked in. Denise in a navy dress she'd clearly bought for the occasion, Roland in a suit that didn't quite fit him anymore because he'd lost weight that year and never mentioned it to me. My parents trailed in behind me like they'd been invited. The lawyer for Caro, a brisk woman named Genevieve, laid out the final paperwork. $61 million, less closing costs, structured as I'd requested. The bulk in a trust for the girl's education, a portion in an investment account, and a final line item I'd added myself 2 weeks earlier without telling anyone, not even Denise. When Genevieve got to that line, she read it aloud, because that's procedure. An outright gift $4 million, the deed to 20 acres of the original property retained in their names, and full ownership of the farmhouse transferred to Denise and Roland. The room went quiet. Denise's hand flew to her mouth. Roland just stared at the paper like he couldn't make the numbers mean what they meant. "You didn't have to." Denise started, and I had to stop her before she finished. Because if she finished, I was going to lose it in front of the lawyers. You gave me land when my own parents wouldn't return my calls, I said. You gave me a home for my children when I had nothing. This isn't a gift, it's 6 years late. My mother's voice cut through the room, sharp and thin. Whitney, that's nearly 7% of the entire sale. To people who aren't even blood. I turned to look at her, and for the first time in my life I felt nothing twist in my stomach when I did it. No flinch, no apology forming on my tongue. They're more family to me than you've been in 6 years, I said. Denise held my hand through chemo appointments you wouldn't drive 20 minutes for. Roland taught my daughters to ride before they could properly walk. You came here today to ask me to fund a gala. My father stepped forward, the way he probably stepped into negotiations at his dealerships, all calm authority. Whitney, be reasonable, we're your parents. There's a connection that supersedes. There's a connection that requires showing up, I said. You can't supersede something you never built. Cassidy, who hadn't said a word the whole time, finally spoke, quietly, mostly to our mother. She's not wrong, Mom. My mother shot her a look that could have cracked glass, and Cassidy didn't say anything else, but she didn't take it back either. I signed the papers. Genevieve slid the pen across for the witnesses, and Denise's hand was shaking so badly when she signed for the deed transfer that Roland had to steady it with his own. My parents left before the small celebration started. My mother said something on the way out about how she hoped I'd remember who raised me, which struck me even then as a strange thing to say to someone who had just given two people who weren't her parents $4 million specifically because they'd done the raising she hadn't. I didn't go to the gala in Muskoka. I sent flowers to Cassidy instead because out of all of them she was the only one who'd told the truth in that room even quietly, even just once. We had Denise and Roland's anniversary renewal 3 weeks later, out on the 20 acres that were now legally theirs. Under a string of lights, Roland insisted on hanging himself despite his hip, despite me telling him to let the contractor do it. Maddox and Sage, 6 years old now, scattered flower petals down the aisle in matching yellow dresses Denise had sewn herself, refusing even with $61 million sitting in a bank account to let me buy them from a store. I stood at the back during the vows, watching Roland's hands shake as he repeated them, watching Denise look at him the way I imagined she'd looked at him 40 years earlier, and I thought about the cold afternoon at Patrick's graveside, my parents already thinking about their flight home. I drove back to the farmhouse alone after the reception ended, windows down, the smell of cut grass and horses thick in the warm June air, my daughters asleep in the back seat with petals still caught in their hair. Patrick never got to see what that land became. But I think he would have known, the way he always seemed to know things about people, that it was never going to be my parents who built it with me. It was always going to be the people who showed up.